What's up guys, so welcome back to Deceptive Sword Techniques Part 5, and today I'm going to show you some upwards attacks and downwards attacks to use against a hanging guard. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, this is basically a hanging guard. Some people have different ways of doing it, and that's fine. I'm not going to get into arguments about which ways are right and which ways are wrong, but for the purpose of this video, as long as the arm is going across the body and it's out in front and the sword is pointing vaguely downwards, I would consider that to be a hanging guard. So there's two places the hanging guard are vulnerable, and that is under the arm here and anywhere coming in here. So yes, you can guard those, you can sweep it out the way there, you can bring it out into an outside guard there, but those are the biggest motions which you need to make in order to block, and the ones which require the best timing. And so those are the places which you generally be wanting to attack somebody who's in a hanging guard. So, first technique to deal with an upwards and downwards attack comes from a seminar I went to a few months back, and you'll start off with this attack here, which has a pretty good chance of hitting by itself, because it is a very quick and very snappy attack, so it has a pretty good chance of landing. But of course, your opponent can try and sweep it out the way there. So what you do is you bring it up. If you don't see them react, everything's good. You just carry it on, get it under their arm, back into guard, back out of range, and you've won the point or you've won the fight. If you do see them start to react, however, what you can do is switch it into a downwards attack instead. You just rotate the wrist around and bring it down that way instead. And this works absolutely beautifully, left-handed versus left-handed, or right-handed versus right-handed, because what's going to happen is when they sweep it across, it's going to push your sword out that way, which, if anything, is going to aid you in bringing it down into a downwards attack. If you're doing it left-handed versus left-handed, left-handed versus right-handed, or vice versa, however, it's going to be pushing your sword out the other way, which could end up having it locked up. You can't bring it around like that. Your wrist just doesn't bend that way. Perhaps you could bring your back foot around and attack like that instead, but that would require a fair amount of skill, and I just don't think it's the best way of dealing with it. If I find myself in that position, I would just be getting back out of range and back into guard instead. So the technique does require a slight amount of modification to work that way, and what you do instead is you want to decide whether or not to turn it into a downward blow or not before your swords actually engage. So watch them carefully. If there's any sign of their guard moving at all before your sword has got to a distance where it's going to engage, then you bring it into a downward attack. If they haven't started moving at that point, then you're probably safe to carry on and win the point that way instead. So that's one way of dealing with it. Of course, so it is a good attack because it is quite difficult for somebody to react to it, but people do react to it, especially if they've seen you use that technique a few times before, and so they will be able to move it out the way and still get into a position to guard it before your attack actually lands. And so one way of dealing with this is to bring a jump into it. So you want to be jumping as you bring the sword up, and then when you're at the top of your motion, bring your attack down then, and that will give you a little bit of an extra angle. So if their sword is here and their head is there, if you get higher, you can get more of an angle there. It's very similar to a longsword technique where you end up bringing it up and down at as much of an angle as possible there, except you're using your legs and generating actual height there to generate the angle rather than doing that uncomfortable wrist position. So that technique is called the bulldog bounce, and it is quite a popular move in English country backswording. I've used it myself in tournaments, and it is possible to pull it off. It does require practice though, it does require athleticism, and on grass it is harder to do than it is on a solid flat floor. So I like to combine both of those moves together. It makes it a little bit harder for them to predict. I can't jump too high in here, but I'll come up and down and hopefully get over their guard that way. So another thing I like to do is, if they're in a hanging guard and I'm in a hanging guard and I'm looking to get under their wrists there, I'll drop into a fool's guard instead. Make sure you're at good enough distance first, so they actually have to step in order to attack, because that way you've got the time to actually react. So I'll drop into a fool's guard. Hanging guard is one of the most fatiguing guards you can possibly do, and the fool's guard is possibly the least fatiguing guard you can do. So it's got a benefit in that regard. Also, the sword is further out the way, which makes it harder for them to judge the distance between you two, because quite often you'll judge your distance by looking at where the tip of their sword is and use that to help you assess what distance you're at. So it's a lot easier to judge distance when you're in a medium guard, for example, than it is in open fight or fool's guard. And also, it's further out the way. Rather than the opponent just having to focus on this area, they all of a sudden have to focus on that massive area there, and that can make it a bit harder as well. So what I'll do from a fool's guard is very simply just try to step in and bring it up there, and hopefully they think they're at a safe distance when they actually aren't. It's quite easy to think you're further away than you actually are, and especially so when it comes to the fool's guard. So just step in there, and by the time the sword has covered that distance, it's travelling very, very fast, and that last little bit, it should be able to cover in maybe a tenth of a second, maybe even slightly less. So it's very, very difficult to block. Their best bet is to simply try to get more distance again. And I do something else to make myself cover that much more distance, and that is I gather the feet together, and I try to do that discreetly without them noticing. So I'll show you what that looks like. So maybe they've gathered towards me, and rather than come to here, where I can leap that far, I'll come to here. Hopefully they're not looking at my feet at the same time, but with the feet bunched together, you can cover a hell of a lot more distance when you're leaping forward, and that can really surprise people sometimes. So that's a few ways of delivering an upwards blow and a downwards blow against hanging guard. So try them out, let me know how you get on, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.